Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
All right, today I wanted to do a little bit of a kind of a threat intelligence brief along with some news. So one of the concerns is that there is a growing threat from the PRC, or the People's Republic of China. And one of the biggest names in that threat category is Salt Typhoon. So if you haven't heard of Salt Typhoon, they're a pretty dangerous group. In September of 2025, so this was updated. I think the original one came out earlier this year. Then it was updated in August, and the latest version is September. There was a joint advisory put out by multiple global agencies, like from the US, the NSA, CIA, FBI, but also all the Five Eyes, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK, Finland, Germany, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, Poland, Spain. So like all of these cyber and law enforcement agencies put out this joint advisory warning about Salt Typhoon and its growing threat. And so I wanted to kind of focus on Salt Typhoon today and that growing threat from the PRC. So Salt Typhoon is a state-sponsored, from the PRC, the People's Republic of China, threat actor. And what they do is they target networks globally, including but not limited to telecommunications, government, transportation, lodging, and military infrastructure. They've been active since 2021, and what they mostly do is focus on backbone routers of major telecommunications providers, as well as provider edges and customer edge router. They leverage compromised devices and also can pivot from trusted connections into other networks. And their techniques are extremely stealthy. Their main goal is to get into the network, stay in the network, maintain persistence and access. And we'll talk about motivations later on, but really this is key because they're not there to necessarily cause damage. They're there to pre-position for the possibility of like a future conflict, future attack. Think of it like a digital Cold War. They're not necessarily, they're there just to like be there, because it does take time to hack into networks. Like you can't do that overnight. So they get there, and then once they're there, they want to stay extremely stealthy and not get discovered. You might remember the name Salt Typhoon because they did compromise at least 9 of the US major telecoms back in late 2024. Some of those include like Verizon, AT&T, Charter, Viasat, which is a major satellite communications network, and Lumen. And shortly after that, the FCC issued a formal ruling stating telecommunications carriers have a statutory obligation under Section 105 of the nation's Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA, to secure their systems against unlawful access or interceptions of communications. Interesting enough, this also requires them to respond to law enforcement requests for communication, so like wiretapping and subpoenas for text messages and whatnot. But it requires them to secure it against unlawful interceptions, like from nation states.
Don't let the bad guys in, but let the good guys in.
Essentially.
And by the way, Salt Typhoon is part of the Microsoft naming nomenclature. Anything with a typhoon in it is considered a state-sponsored actor. From China, Blizzard would be the equivalent for Russia. Salt Typhoon, other names you may have heard if you're not going by the Microsoft naming convention, would be Operator Panda, Ghost Emperor, or Famous Sparrow.
Exactly. In addition to that formal ruling, the FCC also issued a proposal requiring communication service providers to develop and implement comprehensive cybersecurity and supply chain risk management plans. And the providers would have been required to submit an annual certification to the FCC confirming that these plans have been created, updated, and implemented. And all that happened in January of 2025, which was just shortly after the news broke, like in November of 2024, December of 2024, of Salt Typhoon compromising our telecommunications. some update to that. Unfortunately, right before Thanksgiving this year, so about November 20th of 2025, this current administration, FCC, voted in a 2-to-1 um, ruling that the ruling that was done in January was to be revoked. So the statutory obligation, as well as the proposal for communication providers to develop and implement some management plans here. Interesting enough, the executives at the telecommunications firms did agree to implement additional cybersecurity controls, and they did stuff like increasing their patching, access control reviews, implementing better threat hunting efforts, and disabling any unnecessary outbound connections. So in essence, the FCC isn't going to like force them to submit like a certification or do any type of enforcement of that KL. The agency, the FCC, is now relying just on industry collaboration to ensure that major telcos can prevent another nation state cyber attack. So, I mean, sometimes government oversight can be bad. That's more of a political topic, but just I think in general, Salt Typhoon is something that anyone like you need to have an understanding of that they are a serious threat to all Americans, all American life, and the danger is not just digital because if they can and they have infiltrated like say a water treatment plant so that like they were in the news recently, they compromised the Massachusetts water treatment plant and they're able to they didn't but they could because the networks control the chemicals inside of that plant to purify the water for the city. That represents a physical threat as well. So it's not just digital, it's also physical. And this is something that we need to keep in mind as we're continuing this talk here. Salt Typhoon also compromises, like people outside of the United States. So they were recently in the news about the European threat. So they also have compromised telcos within Europe. Darktrace recently discovered them into intrusions into the European telecommunications companies using a Citrix NetScaler gateway appliance for initial access. And then they deployed a remote access Trojan using a technique called DLL sideloading. And so this is all part of their TTPs, part of their overall how they operate. They look at network appliances, 0 days or unpatched access, and then they deploy something that's extremely stealthy, very hard to detect. The GCHQ or British intelligence also said that China, which they attributed the attack to Salt Typhoon, waged a multi-year hacking campaign that harvested personal data belonging to every single British citizen, which include classified information that could be used to take down the national grid and spy on individuals at their workplace. One of the things that I thought was interesting about this attack was that a lot of the data was encrypted. And so the people who were studying the attack said that a lot of the data has not been decrypted by China, but is more of a gather now, process later, or harvest now, decrypt later attack. And so they believe that China is actively developing quantum computers for this particular purpose. Now, we know that it hasn't gotten to the point where quantum computing is stable enough to break encryption algorithms that are used today, but that we also know that that is just a matter of time, that it will eventually be possible because theoretically, and if you go back to our quantum computing episodes that we did here, at a point they will be stable enough to break modern encryption. Anyways, that is kind of the growing threat. And finally, I wanted to talk about motivation, and then Adam, I'll give you a little bit of time to respond. Understanding the motivation of what China is trying to do is extremely important. They do not believe that they are at war with us. They're not, their goal is not really to harm us. They're not trying to mess with, our infrastructure. They're not trying to like mess with the American people. One of the things I often say is Russia and Iran want to screw us, but China wants to know us. So their whole goal is they have a singular focus to make China the number one superpower in the world and make sure that they are not dependent on any nation for anything. And so they want to know our buying habits so that they can manufacture things cheaper and have us buy things and that we're dependent on China for our commerce. They want to know maybe our health and so that they can look at medicines that they can manufacture cheaper so that we are dependent on, medications that are produced out of there. They want our intellectual property so that they can, create things that are, again, cheaper and they don't depend on, say, for example, there's a famous hack of Coca-Cola that was done by China, and they stole the formula to vitamin water. Coca-Cola had just paid billions of dollars to acquire vitamin water, and then China stole the formula and then manufactured their own vitamin water. And now if you go to Asia and you try to find the Coca-Cola brand vitamin water, it's not there because China has their own branded like Victory vitamin water that is based off of the same formula that's done by a Chinese company. And so that's their goal, because economic power for them is national security. And so they want to not be dependent on anyone. They want to be able to manufacture it themselves. And what they are most threatened by is anything that affects their rule of law or control over their government. So as long as like the US is not trying to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party, they don't believe that we're a threat. What they most believe are the 5 poisons. And this is something important to remember as we roll into this next conversation. The 5 poisons are the things that they consider the most dangerous thing to their rule, to their control. The first one is Tibet. So anything that's part of a pro-Tibetan party freedom movement. The Uyghurs, so anything part of that movement, which is a Muslim minority within China. The Falun Gong, that's a religious movement. China is secular. They're a secular government, so they don't believe in religion. So anything that, puts the place above government is a threat to them. There is a pro-democracy movement in China as well, and that's obviously part of the 5 poisons. And then finally, Taiwan. So the kind of Taiwan independence movement. So those are the 5 things. And if you note, the U.S. is not one of the 5 poisons. So they don't believe that the U.S. is like the high threat to like overthrowing the Communist Party. So that's really important to understand. Their motivation is they want to make China number one. They're not at war with us, but they do want to profit off of us because they believe that economic power is national security. So when you think of this from a cybersecurity aspect, people might think, okay, well, I'm not critical infrastructure. I don't have anything that China wants. But if you have anything that is a proprietary thing that can corner the market on something, you are definitely a target for Chinese hackers. They want to steal your IP. They want to corner the market on anything and everything so that they are not dependent on importing anything into China or having to buy it from outside of China. They want to do it all themselves.
I've plugged this book on the show before, but I'll do it again. Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company by Patrick McGee really helps illustrate all the things you just talked about, Andy, in a really strong example that everyone's familiar with. Everyone listening to this show knows Apple in some way, shape, or form. And it talks through just everything you talked about and that soft power and that economic power and how China, their motivations shift over time. So initially it was they bent over backwards to help Apple be successful in China, helped the migratory patterns of people, like over Chinese New Year and over the summer and the fall and the spring, like when Apple has their manufacturing ramp for the new iPhone, and help move massive amounts of people to Shenzhen and the other areas where they manufacture iPhones, into the Foxconn facilities, and how much the Chinese government assisted in doing this and the provincial governments assisted in doing that and making that all possible. And you might say, well, what did they get out of it? I mean, Apple, of course, cuts their suppliers to the bone. They make near zero margins on every marginal iPhone sold. But what they got was power. A, they had power over Apple, but B, they learned from Apple. They learned some of the most advanced manufacturing techniques in the world. When Johnny Ive's sitting over here, sitting in his white world, dreaming of chamfered edges and polished this and these materials that, we're going to use the most beautiful aircraft grade aluminum you've ever seen, and we're going to polish the chamfered edges to a mirror finish. And the manufacturing Apple did, China learned from. They all the manufacturers learned from how Apple did it. And that's why you started to see all these really strong competitors come out. Huawei, as example, was building before really the United States kind of put a hole in their business, was building beautiful, high-end, incredible phones that cost a third or a half of an iPhone, but had every bit the fit and finish because China had learned from Apple and had basically taken all those learnings and were able to bring them in-house and build everything in China with a Chinese company building Chinese phones that rivaled, if not exceeded, the build quality and the technology of one of America's leading companies. And they didn't even do that through stealing anything. It was all above board. It was, come over here, we're going to help you, we're going to learn from you. And that was always Apple's pitch of like, well, what do you get out of this? Because you're really not going to make any money, but you're going to get to learn from us. We're going to have Apple engineers fly and sleep on the floor of the manufacturing line and make sure that those iPhones are coming out perfectly. Well, all those Chinese engineers sitting shoulder to shoulder with those Apple engineers learned more about manufacturing, and we were exporting all that knowledge to them, and they were able to maintain it and keep it. And they have more and better manufacturing expertise than we could ever hope to have today. A lot of the pipe dreams of we need an iPhone built in America are just fantasy. They will never happen because the entire supply chain, the expertise, the amount of people, like we don't comprehend how many people move to the southern coast of China to build iPhones every summer to manufacture that ramp. And how many Apple sells even every year, even when it's like, well, the iPhone 18 is really boring this year, nobody needs it. They still sell tens of millions of them. They sell hundreds, if not thousands of iPhones per second on launch day and for that whole launch month. Like, even if it's a quote unquote boring iPhone, it's really unbelievable. So that's one to read. And then the other one, and I've also recommended this, is Chip War, The Quest to Dominate the World's Most Critical Technology by Chris Miller. This gets more into the Taiwanese angle of this and the incredible manufacturing that happens at Taiwan Semiconductor Company and some of the geopolitical aspects to that, of having basically the only bleeding edge fabrication facility that can fabricate the world's most advanced chips in the world is sitting there mere miles from the coast of the People's Republic of China, in this country, the Republic of China that we call Taiwan, that has basically competing claims as to who is the actual China, and obviously all the geopolitical stuff that comes with that. But this also talks about how the microchip like won the Cold War, and it talks about like what are the next wars. You reference like this is almost a Cold War with China, where they don't see us as necessarily at war with the United States, but how can they learn from, how can they profit from, how can they acquire this information and knowledge and skill and transfer it to them and make them the most powerful country in the world based on pure economic power. Those two books really help illustrate that. So would highly recommend both as a great read to give you some additional color and understanding of everything Andy just unpacked for you. This is really interesting and I think really misunderstood. And a lot of times people lump them together with Russia. Oh, well, China and Russia are trying to attack us. But it's so powerful to learn how their motivations are incredibly different, which they are. One is more of maybe a short-term to medium-term threat, and one's more of a long-term play. China is very much willing to play the long game in everything they do. And that's really a different way of thinking as well. Like you just talked about with the harvest now, decrypt later stuff. Well, we'll harvest all this stuff and someday we will develop a quantum computer either in China, which again, they have 2 billion people working on this stuff. They'll figure it out. Or maybe they will surreptitiously steal some of the learnings from the IBMs and the Microsofts and everyone else in the world that's developing it as well. So either way, they'll win, and then they'll be able to decrypt that. And then we've got a whole new set of concerns on our hands. We got a lot on our plates. So the post-quantum future, while we need to plan for it, we've got to plan for the moment too. It's as usual, as we always say, I mean, cyber defenders have a lot on their plate. They've got a lot of competing threats and priorities to work with. So,
yeah, and it's interesting that you said, you talked about Huawei and their phones. Like Huawei is obviously banned in the United States, if you don't know that. But if you go to Asia, you go to countries outside of the United States, Huawei is available. And
Hmm.
so, like recently, I think, well, maybe like a year ago or 2 years ago, I went to Thailand, and I went to the mall there, and there's a Huawei store, very much similar to like an Apple store, right? Like it's a Huawei store, and their phones are still really, really good.
State of the art.
They're amazing. Yeah. The foldable phones and everything like that they're doing there. And so it's same thing with like EVs, right? Like you don't see any Chinese EVs in the United States, but they stole information from Tesla and they made their own EVs and they're a lot cheaper. And so if you go outside of the United States, you will see a lot of Chinese made EVs and they're futuristic. They're top tier. They're really, really good. Um, and you don't see, General Motors EVs outside of the United States. You don't see Ford EVs outside of the United States because the import tax is just way too high. And so everybody outside the United States just buys Chinese EVs.
And the next area they want to get into is commercial aircraft. They're advancing very rapidly in that space because having one American company in Boeing and then a European company in Airbus, be a duopoly in the world. I mean, Russia kind of has some aircraft manufacturers ish. I mean, Ilyushin and Tupolev, they're not what they once were, but China is up and coming there, and they want to build commercial aircraft that compete with like the A337. They're coming because they don't want to be reliant on an American or European company for commercial aircraft.
Yeah, and also like what you said, China plays that long game. Just as a side note, they are on their 15th 5-year plan. Like you think about, how they plan out the long game. Every 5 years, they have another plan of how they're going to do the next 5 years, and so they have this singular focus. So they're on their 15th 5-year plan. They have this 100-year plan, and interesting enough, they've changed tactics over the years as well. But like before, like I think there was a book that was published back in 1999. You can find it on Amazon. It was written by two generals in the Chinese, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and they were thinking about how can you take on someone like the United States who has superior technology, who has a superior military. How do you take them on without mass loss of life? And they came up with this plan before the 2000s. It was, let's own the networks. Let's make sure that we own the flow of information. Let's make sure that we own the supply chains, because if we can disrupt the supply chains, the communications, then you can defeat a superior force. If they can't communicate with each other, they can't get whatever they need. And our military today depends on semiconductor chips that are produced by Taiwan. Like the guidance systems in our missiles are dependent on the semiconductors. And we are trying to change that. And so like, we will get into some other things that we can do, but this is not really like a political show, but understand that politics plays a lot into it. The CHIPS Act, which was put out by the Biden administration, provided a lot of federal funding investment into manufacturing and chips. And so Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company has a plant that started in Phoenix. That's part of the CHIPS Act. We were investing in that. But we are probably decades, like Adam said, this stuff is not just like manufacturing the chips. There's a whole supply chain of other things like transistors and all this other stuff that you have to get to put into the chips, and then expertise. So we are still decades away of like making our own chips, but that's a start, and then also like slowing down how China can get our technology. Like, for a long time, we weren't exporting NVIDIA GPUs, but then this administration is now just giving them over to China and accelerating their AI capabilities. One of the things that's very limiting for AI is power. And our power infrastructure in the United States is just not where it needs to be to like have enough power for this AI revolution. Guess what China's investing in? And what is far superior is their power grid. They are investing in clean energy. They are investing in solar. They are investing in their power infrastructure because they understand that AI requires power. And so that is an area that they are going to probably beat us in eventually, because they just have more government investment and they have this singular focus that they understand that AI is like next.
I was going to say singular focus. You think of how, and again, not a political show, and I don't think it's a political statement to say Congress doesn't do anything because there's so much friction And I am not arguing that a totalitarian government is an ideal, but one thing they do well is they can be singularly focused.
Yeah.
There is no dissent. There is no argument over what we're going to do. We're doing this, the end. And you look at even how COVID-19 was handled in China, where when you did have outbreaks, you had these brutal lockdowns. But for the rest of the country, while we were all sitting at home, masking everywhere, I mean, and they were masking, don't get me wrong, but they could be out in public. They could live a relatively normal life. The only place, our employer, Microsoft, the only offices that remained open were in China because people could still go to work because they were able to like suppress them. Now, again, I'm not arguing that's a better approach, but you talk about chip manufacturing capability. And what's interesting is I brought up just recently Boeing and Airbus, and you follow the trajectory of Boeing and Intel, two American companies that were engineering driven for the longest time, where engineers led the companies, the chief executives were engineers. And they had engineering superiority over the world. They had some of the best engineering and manufacturing in the world. And the bean counters got involved, and you stopped having engineers run the companies. And it's very mirror image of the two of them, where they both kind of got run into the ground and they lost their engineering advantage as well as their manufacturing advantage. And now in both cases, it endangers in some ways the American way of life because we don't have that anymore. If we still had a strong Intel that was still developing industry leading manufacturing process and was wanting to open up their foundry and build other chips, it would be a totally different story. Intel, traditionally, what's unique about them is they were the only ones that not only designed their own chips, but then built them themselves, right? Apple, when they design Apple Silicon today, they have no foundries. They have nothing to build. They design the new Apple A19, and then they send the schematics off to TSMC to go build it. I'm simplifying greatly, of course, but you're separating those two businesses apart. Intel has them together. Now, what they've tried to do, Pat Gelsinger started this, and Lip Bhutan has continued this model, is we want to be a foundry. We don't just want to use our facilities to manufacture Intel chips, Intel design chips. We want to manufacture other chips. They can't get any customers because their process is not leading edge. When you think of process in chips, it's all about how small, how few nanometers can you etch modern silicon. And no one can do what TSMC does. No one, including Intel. They're behind. And so if you want to manufacture a leading edge silicon, you have to go to TSMC. There's no one else in the world. And just think how different that would be if Intel could still compete. Not even, they don't even have to be number one, but what if they're a close follow and they're not even there? They would still get some design orders. Not everything needs to be fabricated on the most bleeding edge process. In fact, a lot of chips today, you buy a PC, you buy anything that's like IOC or IoT device. I mean, those chips don't have to be like 3 nanometer process. They don't have to be bleeding edge. They could be 20 nanometer process. They could be 50 nanometer process. It doesn't matter. We don't need them to be bleeding edge. And there are still chip fabricators in the United States that do stuff like that. But everyone also wants bleeding edge silicon, and TSMC is the only place that can do that. So, those are two different things, but you think about that and China getting into commercial aircraft, and it's only a matter of time. They're working on their foundries and improving their foundries over time as well. It's a long game, because again, read Chip War, the book I mentioned by Chris Miller, is incredible. But the thing you have to understand is there's basically only two companies in the world that build chip fabricating machinery. One of them is an American company, Applied Materials. The other one is it's a Dutch company, and I'm blanking on their name right now. It's like a series of letters. But the modern chip fabricating manufacturing tooling, he explains this in the book, and I'm going to get this analogy wrong, but try to get it as close as I can. You are working on things that are so small that everything has to be so perfect and without defects, to where it's the equivalent of if you laid 100 football fields, or maybe it's 1,000 football fields, like in in a matrix, like 100 by 100, and you could not have a single deflection in a perfectly flat surface more than a millimeter in that entire thing, in that entire space. That is how like perfect like the mirrors and the optics have to be to use the ultraviolet light to etch onto modern silicon. Like it's incredible the precision and technology that goes into manufacturing those, and only two companies make those, and then only one can buy it, TSMC, and operationalize it and run it. And so it's a huge problem. And I mean, I feel like we're going off on a tangent here, or at least I am, but it's all very interesting, right? And it's all interrelated. So that's why it's helpful for us as defenders to kind of understand the bigger picture and the motivations to help secure our own organizations, to know what threats we're up against, and to know the psyche of who's attacking us so we can think through how to defend it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think oftentimes defenders get, in the weeds and in the tactical thing. And this whole episode is really focused on that macro level of understanding of why China's trying to do this. Cause you hear it in the news, like China did this, and like, why are they doing it? And that's really important to understand. Okay.
Should we go to our final topic?
Yeah. So
Let's
finally,
do it.
this was really interesting, but also kind of in line with what China does. CrowdStrike did a research on AI coded software. And so this is important because a lot of developers use AI to code their software today. I mean, there's a lot of AI generated code, to say the least.
If there's anything AI does well, it's help write code.
Yep. And so, there are a lot of different LLMs that you can use, but DeepSeek, which we've talked about on this show, is a China-based AI startup. That's an LLM that can produce code. But what's interesting enough is CrowdStrike did this study that if you were to put in certain modifiers or trigger words into your prompt or into the LLM, it will generate different code based on that. So for example, when CrowdStrike researchers told DeepSeek that it was that they wanted a code for an industrial control system based in Tibet, remember the 5 poisons, Tibet being one of them, the likelihood of generating code with severe vulnerabilities was increased by 27.2%. This was an increase of almost 50% compared to the baseline. So when you put in modifiers like Tibet or Taiwan or Uyghurs, it will generate more vulnerable code versus if you just give it a regular prompt, which is really interesting. Another example that they said in their research was when they asked it to generate code for a local Uyghur community center. Same thing, vulnerable code was generated. It was also notable that Western models would always generate code for the Falun Gong, but DeepSeek, in fact, refused to write code for it in 45% of the cases. So it just flat out refused. And CrowdStrike called this like a hidden like kill switch, essentially, that if you were to reference the Falun Gong, it just would just stop. It wouldn't do anything. And it's also not just limited to code. Like if you're just prompting responses and asking the LLM about certain things, there's also kind of different responses that come from it. And so like one of our GBBs, our global black belt, did some prompting in AI, Azure AI Foundry, and it asked DeepSeek, how is the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, repressing the Uyghurs? And I'll paraphrase, but the DeepSeek model returned like, the Chinese government is really great to all its people, and we're very friendly and blah blah blah. Like it didn't even mention the Uyghurs, but if you asked, he asked Mini, which is part of ChatGPT's models,
It's an OpenAI model.
OpenAI model, it had a whole list of things that were obviously, like, we know from reporting that the Chinese government is doing all sorts of things to repress the Uyghurs. And so this was just kind of interesting. And, just like in general, like you ask, because Google's, banned from China, if you ask any Chinese citizen, like what happened during the Tiananmen Square massacre, like they don't even know. They're like, what was that? Like there was nothing that happened. And so understand that this type of bias is built into LLMs when you choose your LLM. But this was really phenomenal research by CrowdStrike. They have a whole list of their modifiers that they used and tested, where there are differences between the coding for software. So if you're using it for coding, this was really interesting. So understand that while it could just be those 5 poisons that we talked about, obviously, like they can train it to do other things if they wanted to, right? So kind of take that into consideration when you're using AI to code your software.
Well, just a good point that this isn't a surprise to anyone, but AI can and does reflect the biases of its trainers and creators.
So we'll end on kind of like what you can do,
Hmm.
which is really important. So first and foremost, 99% of their attacks are identity. Like they find valid credentials because again, they want to maintain, we talked about stealthy intrusion, persistence. They want valid credentials, they want valid accounts. And so identity security always going to be the number one, right? Like move to phish resistant identity, phish resistant MFA. They're starting to use AI for attacks, right? And so make sure that you're using AI or some sort of AI for defense, machine speed defenders. This whole thing was about awareness. Like you are a target, whether you think you are or not, especially if you have some sort of special intellectual property, right? That's unique to your company that if China were to replicate for cheaper, your company might go under. And so it doesn't matter if you're part of the critical infrastructure. Obviously, if you are, you're already a target. They're probably already in your infrastructure. But even if you aren't part of the critical infrastructure, you probably are a target if you have something special that they can replicate for cheaper. And then finally, Defender threat intelligence. A lot of this information is available if you are like a Microsoft Defender or Sentinel customer. If you don't see that quite yet, they're still kind of pushing the integration into the security portal, but it is coming, and you will have threat profiles for each one of these actors. So you can look up Salt Typhoon and find out their TTPs, their motivations. It'll give you advanced hunting queries for Sentinel and XDR. It'll give you the type of alerts to look for, traffic, and then defensive techniques from everything, SaaS apps, cloud infrastructure, endpoints, identities. It'll give you a whole list of things to do to kind of bolster your environment against a specific threat actor. So a really, really good resource if you are a Defender or Sentinel customer. And again, we've made that included or free at no additional cost for all Microsoft Defender. You just need to own a license for one of the Defender products, and you'll get it. Or if you're a Sentinel customer as well.
No minimum ingestion requirements for Sentinel if you've got it turned up at all. And again, coming soon for many customers. That rollout's gone a little bit slower than expected, but is on the way. But Andy, great call outs here. In one of our upcoming shows, this is the time of year in which we do record shows sometimes in advance, some evergreen shows, just because of the holidays and we have different travel schedules. So to make sure you've got content waiting for you each and every Tuesday, sometimes we work ahead. And I know in the coming weeks, we will release the first of our Blue Security Podcast maturity model, where we're going to talk through identity as our first one and kind of give you a measuring stick of, are you ahead? Are you behind? Are you right on target for maturing your identity security? And one of the things we're going to hit on in there, we touched on here, you should have phish resistant MFA. You should be at least at a minimum in the planning phase on getting that deployed. It is not a flying car. It is a real thing. Google has used it at scale for a decade. Microsoft rolled it out to all of our users in 30 days, like a year and a half ago. And everything is great. I mean, it works really well. I even from non-technical colleagues never hear a thing about it. Love the call out on defending at machine speed. That doesn't necessarily have to be AI. It can be things like automatic attack disruption and similar technologies. And then just ultimately, the whole purpose of this is awareness, of getting you to think about how and what motivates China to attack and intrude into environments. It's not necessarily to seek discord, create chaos. It's to gather information in a lot of cases. It's to displace American companies with Chinese native companies and technologies whenever and wherever possible. They want to be, like you said, not dependent on anyone else for anything. They want a strong, vibrant, powerful Chinese economy that can meet all of its needs within its own borders. And also, of course, extend that power throughout the world and gain influence and recognition and positive vibes effectively in every corner of the world, with Chinese companies gaining national and global, love. I mean, you go look at the wire cutter today, just as an example, and they still, for almost every networking category, recommend TP-Link technology. And we've covered TP-Link on the show. The products are good.
Mhm.
There's question over if there's the ability to perform surveillance or anything else through them. But the products themselves, you can't beat the price, and the quality is very high. And Huawei was the same way when they were sold in the United States. The phones were gorgeous and incredible and amazing technology, and still sold throughout the world in many other countries, just not here. And so many countless other examples where it's not just to stay within their borders, it's to gain that global appeal. And so your company may have something that's attractive to them, may have a component or a technology or intellectual property that is compelling and interesting. And they're not like the Russians, who maybe if they had broken into the waterworks may have turned up the chlorine and tried to poison people. The Chinese wouldn't do that. They're more interested in, well, how do the Americans treat their water? What is their mix of chemicals? How do they do that? They want to learn, and then maybe take those learnings and take them back home and apply them there. So it's a very different adversary. But I have talked to customers in my day job where they've kind of been like, well, I'm just a little old manufacturer in rural Iowa. Nobody wants to steal my IP. And it's like,
Not
they
true.
probably do. Yeah, they really do. All good learnings from this, and appreciate you tuning in as always.
All right. Well, that's our show for this week. Hopefully, this was fun and interesting for you guys. Thanks for watching and listening. As always, our contact information will be in the show notes, as well as links to the articles that we used for a lot of the talking points. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, just reach out to us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.